Okay, so we wanted to go over React setup and routing, just a review on routing. And I feel like there was a third thing. Exona, do you remember what it was?
Oh, did I write that? Oh, how we can link CSS from one page as and
That
use
was
it
it.
from a
Yeah,
router to another page.
you got it. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Um,
Thank God I remembered.
uh, I totally should have written that down. So we are going to dive in with a review on routing, and then we'll use the rest of class, which should be most of it, on just open office hours so you guys can work on your project and ask any questions as they come up or work on homework. So I'm going to create a new project from scratch. And the most important thing to remember here is this is about understanding the commands. So one of the hardest things, and I think you guys are all over this hump, but one of the hardest things with learning how to program is it isn't about the code that we're writing in terms of the steps. It's understanding the steps, right? Okay, yes, I know that if I run this CD and this npx and this start command, it's going to start up my code and do everything that I want. But do I understand why I'm running that command? Do I understand what that command is doing? Do I understand how I'm telling the computer to do that command? And so that's why getting a React project set up is so important, is understanding what those commands are doing. And so we start at the very beginning step of the terminal of, do we understand what our CD command is doing? CD change directory, but whenever we're in the terminal, it's like we're in Finder, right? We're in some current path. So if I run pwd, that stands for print working directory. Most commands are abbreviations, right? So we print our working directory. We say, hey, where are we at currently in our terminal? We are in our home folder. So in order to create a new React app, before we can create it, we've got to change our working directory, or CD change directory, to where we want our React app to be created. So to make this process a little bit easier, I'm going to go to my desktop, to my code. You don't have to follow along with this, by the way. We're not going to use any of this code. This is just like a little sandbox for us to review. So I'm going to go into week 16, and I'm going to create a new folder called day 4. And this is where I want my React app to be created, right? So what I'm going to do is, normally we would CD around in our directories, in our terminal. So I would say ls, and I would say, hey, I want to get down into my desktop. Ls stands for list the files that I have an option to get to. So I would type in cd desktop, and then no command runs until I hit enter. So I hit enter on that, and this says I'm now in the desktop. But to prove that, I could run my pwd and see that I'm down at the desktop level. The reason why learning the terminal 40 plus years since Microsoft DOS came out, not that the terminal is in DOS, but similar to DOS, is that whenever we SSH into a server, basically whenever we say, hey, I would like to access the server and run these commands on the server, there is no user interface for that. Think about the differences between curl and postman, and that's why we do things in the terminal, right? Sometimes there's not a user interface built for the server, built for whatever we're trying to run, and we need to tell the computer, hey, go run this command. One example of the commands that we run are on starting up our React server. There's no start button in React, right? There's no application we run to get React started. We start React by running npm start in the terminal, and that's what makes our React code run, compile, show up in the browser, auto update, all of that good stuff. So anyway, we could keep on going here, right? We could keep on saying ls, see whatever my options are, cd into my folder, and use tab for autocomplete, and that gets us one step further into where we're trying to go. However, the shortcut that we've been using is, the Mac is always very drag and drop friendly. So what we do is we type in cd space, And then we go over to Finder and we drag in our path. That fills in the entire directory path all the way up from the very top level of my hard drive, so that when we run pwd, it's jumped us in several levels deep. This is not a review you asked for. However, it's a review you're getting because the terminal is certainly important, and understanding what each one of those commands are. Hey, we're CDing, we're changing whatever our working directory is, whatever folder we kind of have open in our terminal. And that's what we're doing, is we're getting down to that level. Any questions on any of the terminal review stuff before we switch over to React?
Actually,
Yes.
What website or resource would you recommend for us for codes, for commands?
For the terminal, that's a really tough one because there is no agreed upon boundary of what commands you use every day, right? There are all kinds of commands that someone who's working in a server may use, but you would never use because you're using VS Code instead. So let me pull up our schedule, because I think at some point we did intro to the terminal. And on that outline, I listed out some common commands that I use. So week 13, day 1, in that outline, we have some terminal prompts that we use. And there is also a terminal cheat sheet that I linked to, which has some common commands. So I will share both of these in the live stream channel. Let's see if this link copies over.
You said week 13, day 2?
Week 13, day 1.
1, thank you.
And I will also put them in the live stream. And if those resources are not helpful for you, and you feel like, hey, you know what, Max shared these, I read them, I still don't get them, just let me know. I can go find some other resources or dig in somewhere in. I was not thinking of that outline, but I was thinking of a different outline where we started working with the terminal and I listed out some common commands. But of course, I was not smart enough to put that on the schedule. And now because of that, I'll never be able to find, I'll never be able to find it in the outlines. But proof that I'm human, right? Not perfect. If that cheat sheet doesn't help you, if those resources don't help you, let me know and I can find some other ones that may be a little bit more help. It's kind of a long tail pattern. We keep on needing the terminal less and less the more time that goes on, but it's approaching the limit of 0 without ever actually reaching it. So as more and more time goes on, the less and less terminal we need. But as developers, there will always be some need for the terminal at some level. If you're doing front-end web development only, you may be able to be on that side where you don't really need the terminal. You can get by with tools that all have user interfaces built with it. But unfortunately, once we get into full stack, we definitely need to get a little bit more comfortable with the terminal. And for me personally, the terminal was a lot like Git. I hated it because I didn't understand it, and I wanted to understand all of it. But once I understood, hey, there's just a subset of features that I really need to understand, that made me hate it a whole heck of a lot less when I went to actually use it. Git is kind of one of those things that's ginormous and you don't know why you need it, and you're getting by writing all of your code fine without it. And then you fight it because your team is using it and you are afraid of losing your code. You're afraid of committing it in right. You're afraid of having that log. You don't really understand it, and then all of a sudden you start using it and you get in the swing of it, and then you're like, oh, this is actually pretty nice. This is a nice collaboration tool that almost the entire industry agrees on using. So Git and terminal are very similar there in that you hate it, you hate it, you hate it. You understand what you need to understand of it, and all of a sudden you don't hate it anymore. It's a very binary thing, at least to me. Okay. So we CD'd in, we've gotten down to where we want to go. Now we're kind of switching modes. We're still going to be in the terminal, but we're going to run a command here called npx. And npx is basically the way to say, hey, go to node package manager, np, and execute a command using one of the things that node package manager knows how to do. And one of those commands is create React app. And if you're curious about learning more about create React app, I'll ask Caitlin to add this to the outline for the resource. But you can head over to npm, npmjs.com, and up in their search bar, you can do a search for create React app. And inside create React app, you can see this has 130,000 downloads. I'm kind of surprised that it doesn't have more, but in there, it links to the getting started and the user guide, right? And their getting started is going to show you all of the commands that we use, along with some other information like folder structure and styles and all of that kind of stuff. So if you're curious more about create React app, you can definitely check out their documentation along with any npm package we're using. Chances are that uses chances are that has documentation on npm. Sorry, I was caught off guard. Ryan just said that I noticed you were talking about terminals recently, and said that in one of his office hours, he went through a lot of that stuff too. If students wanted another perspective or explanation and approach, that might be an option. So if you are feeling like you want to learn more about the terminal, but don't get it the way I understand it, that's totally fine. That's all part of learning and different perspectives. Go check out one of Ryan's office hours, and he may explain it in a different way that kind of makes sense to you.
My 2 cents is just learn what you need to like direct yourself for like starting projects and whatnot, and the rest of it is blah. Like I'm not gonna, I mean, like you said, when we get to like full stack, we're gonna have to learn more. But for what it is, at the moment, I just PWD, LS, CD, call it a day, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the best way to get started is, hey, I'm not going to go try and go out and be a Linux terminal master. I'm not going to master Bash or Shell, which are kind of components that make the terminal work, or a part of it as a whole. Just learn what you need to learn. And the best way to get started, in my opinion, is get comfortable changing directories. I know that sounds so basic, but get comfortable with PWD, LS, and CD, and make sure you've mastered those. Make sure that when you get in a folder, you figure out how to move to the folder that that folder is in. Make sure you understand, hey, when I'm in my terminal and I've CD'd around, I can run that LS command and combine that with CD and understand how to change my working directory into that folder. That's my personal approach, is once you've got all of your working directory navigation down, all of a sudden the barrier to entry of learning and feeling confident and comfortable with the terminal becomes much easier. I'm sure that there are Linux developers who work on building the terminal every day that would be horrified with that approach. But that's the approach that I took. And once I mastered that, I felt a lot more comfortable in running other commands. So thank you, Schneider, for chiming in there. Okay, so we are going to npx create React app, and create React app needs one piece of information. It needs to know what the name of our app is that we're going to use. And so I'm just going to call this playground. Only because it's a little sandbox, you know, we're just writing some code that we're probably going to throw away here or never actually do anything with. This is just about getting practice. So what Create React App is doing for us is not only is it creating a package.json file, it's installing all kinds of dependencies that we need to get our React app working. So that means installing React itself. That means getting Webpack working under the hood so that all of our React code and our JSX is going to be runnable in the browser. It's going to get our node modules folder created and start loading packages in on that. It's going to be not only installing React, but all the dependencies of React. What other NPM packages does React use that we need to install so React knows how to use it? So at the end of the day, when we run a command, we can run open space period. And this is a good little hack. It will open up your folder in Finder. Based off of whatever working directory you're in. So when we open this playground folder, not only did Create React App make this folder for us, it also got everything created in here. Our SRC folder with our beginning app.js and app.css. It got our node modules installed. It generated our package.json. Everything that you need to get a React app started is much, much easier when you use something like Create React App. So now that we're in here, we are not going to make the mistake of starting to install components because we're not in the project's working directory. When we PWD, we're in week 16, day 4. Where do we need to be? We need to be in our playground folder. So we're going to CD into playground. You'll notice I never type a full folder name out. I type the first couple letters and hit the tab key, and that will auto-complete the name of the folder for me. Now, we could run npm start here and get our project started, but there is a package that we need. There are actually 2 packages that we will need, thinking about what question Zona has coming up. One of the first packages that we need is React Router DOM. The router we don't need it in every single React project, but we need it in whatever React project we have that has multiple pages. Think of a page as a path or URL, right? Whenever we have something completely separate with something that we want to be able to link between different pages, we need the router because the router is not built into React. The router is what controls, based off of what path is in the route, what component to show. We are also going to install one other package here called Sass. Now, you may notice that I just put a space in there and listed another package. npm install will install as many things as you want, just separated with a space between them. So running this command is the equivalent of running 2 npm install commands, one with installing the router and the other one with installing Sass. So this is just a little shortcut to say we can install multiple things all at the same time with the same install command. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter on that. That's going to go out to npm. That's going to install those 2 dependencies. And for now, we are done with project setup. Now, down the road, if you're working on your project and you say, oh, there's some other npm package that I would like to use, you can always stop your React server and run npm install with whatever package you're trying to install, and then that will go in your node modules. Taking a breath there for 1 second, does anyone have questions?
So how can you install those if you've already created the file? How can you install them after? Because I just tried to do it on the terminal in my project, but then it just on my package.json, and then it just
So did you CD into your playground folder before you installed them?
No, I have my React app up.
Okay,
my Visual Studio, yeah.
So if you look in your package.json, does it say React Router DOM in it?
Yep. And Sass, never mind, thank you.
So that means it did install, so you're good to go.
Okay.
Artrell, go ahead.
All right. So every time we start the terminal, we don't have to install the playground, do we? I feel like we've done that before, so that means it stays with us.
It's not that we're installing the playground. It's that we're generating a new React project called Playground. And the place that we are generating that React project is wherever our working directory is. So what we did is, it's not just that we ran npx create React app playground right up here. It's that we had all of these commands that let us CD down into where we wanted our React app to be created. And then when we ran create React app, it created it wherever we CD'd into.
Okay, now with that being said, playground, is that just a way for us to just like play around with like React and do stuff like that?
I could have called that throwaway React code if I wanted to, and it would work exactly the same way.
Okay.
It's just that when we create a React project, it has to go into its own folder, and create React app is like, what do you want to name that folder? So I could have called that sandbox. I could have called that dummy code. I could have called that whatever I wanted to. But whenever I ran that command, it's going to create that folder in whatever I CD'd down into.
So basically we're creating the folder for a React project.
The folder, and then all the starter files that we need to get a React project going. The package.json, the node modules, the source folder, the public folder, all of that stuff create React app is creating for us.
So that's necessary. Once that's established, then we can do the npm start.
Yes.
Okay, now it's making more sense. I know we've just been doing it, but I just want to make sure. I'm like, playground? I know we did that once before. Now I realize normally we name it whatever project we're working on for that day.
You got it. Yes.
Light bulb moment.
That's why we're going over this. That's why we have our catch up weeks. Schneider, if you have a question, get in line, raise your hand. We got two other questions.
Line? Oop, my bad.
Jennifer, go ahead.
Hi. Did we install SAS yesterday and I missed it? Or can't we install it?
If we use SAS files, then yes, we have to install SAS into our node package before we are able to use it.
Okay, so it's not something I could go back and install into the computer.
It is. You're not really, whenever you run that install command, there is a way to install it, what we call globally, onto the computer. But we normally don't install packages globally. We install packages into our specific package or into our specific project. So just because we installed SAS on our playground package or our playground project doesn't mean that we can use SAS in another React project that we created somewhere else. The reasoning behind that is, think about if you started using React 10 years ago. Right? React 10 years ago, I don't even know if React was out 10 years ago, but that's not my point. React has changed a lot over the years, and there have been a lot new features that have come out to React. So if you installed React on your computer globally, whenever you updated React to the latest version, it may break some of your older projects. Well, we don't really want that. We want to say, hey, we're working on a new project here. Let's use the latest version of React. So because of that, if you look in your package.json, you can see that React is using version 18.2.0. Now, if you go back to the very first React projects we created, it may not be on 18.2. It could be on 18.0 or 18.1. Because our package.json installs React based off of this project. So every copy, every project we has their own specific versions of whatever packages we install. So when you install it, you're installing it usually to the project level, not to the global computer level.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Because I was like, can we do that now if we haven't?
That's also important as you go on too, because like just recently I had a problem with a version of React. The newest version of React was not compatible with a package the package I wanted to use was not compatible with the newest version of React. And so I had to downgrade my React version to be able to use this package. So that's another reason why installing things globally is not always recommended.
Nice. Okay.
So
That's
just to add 2 cents.
Very good point. Yes, totally agree.
okay. Thank you.
No problem. Kalai, go ahead.
So once I make this file, then HTML and CSS in this one, right, Max?
So once you make it, once you run that Create React app, you'll see that you already have an SRC folder with all of these files in it. So that's where you would want to start working on your React code, is in here.
Okay, so I just need to change whatever, like class is changed to class name, that kind of thing, right? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And it's worth noting here that every time that you create a React app, you will not be moving some vanilla HTML and JavaScript over, right? That's been the case for us. And it's a very good way to get practice in your React, is saying, hey, here's something that's already working. Now let's try and get it working in React. However, work with Caitlin, when a new feature comes our way, we already have a project. That project we've been writing code in for years, quite literally years. And so when a new feature comes up, we don't build that feature in regular HTML and JavaScript and then move it into React. We just go right into our existing React app and make a new component, make a new route, and just start building it right in React. So I want to make it clear that even though we've been doing a lot of HTML to React conversion, that doesn't necessarily mean that whenever you write new React code, you have to do it in HTML first. Okay, now Schneider, it's your turn.
What's the command to install them node modules after you delete them?
Just npm install with no package name after it, and then hit enter, and that will regenerate your node modules folder.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's a weird one because you're used to npm install and then whatever package names you need to install. But if you don't put any in there, it will go to the package.json folder file and look at all of the dependencies in here, and then go ahead and reinstall all of the things in node modules.
Okay.
Or into node modules, I should say. Any other questions? Okay, so here we had the foresight to install our React Router DOM at the beginning of a package, at the beginning of the project. While sometimes that is the case, most of the times it's not. When you're working on a new feature, for example, we covered date FNS, date functions yesterday, right? And that was something that Schneider built the whole app and got his API working. And he said, all right, I want to now be able to format a date. Okay, well, that's something that we didn't think of at the beginning of the project, but we stopped our React server. We did our npm install date-fns. We hit enter, and that installed. That is probably even more common than installing packages right at the beginning of a project. So I just want to mention that if you do find things that you want to install, it's no worse for the project if you install it halfway into the project or right at the beginning of the project. Okay, so now we've got to do our setup. Our setup, hopefully this is repetitive for you. We go to our app.css, we delete everything in our app.css. Normally we would go to public and index.html and drop in our bootstrap. But because we're not going to go over any bootstrap related concepts directly, I'm going to skip that step. I'm going to go to my app.js. I'm going to delete out my import for the logo. I'm going to delete out my entire header component. And now I've got a good starting point. And last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on my package.json. I'm going to open an integrated terminal, and I'm going to run npm start. Now, what's npm start doing? Well, first of all, before I even run my npm start, I'm going to run a pwd, and that shows me I'm down in my playground folder. Well, how did that magically happen? Whenever we right-click over here and open an integrated terminal, VS Code is polite enough to CD us down into whatever folder we right-clicked on is in. So that's just a quick way to say, hey, we don't need to CD down all the way to that level. VS Code has already done that for us. Now, what does npm start do? That is actually starting a React server. And our React server is taking all of our JSX code and transpiling it. Think of compiling versus translating. Put those two together. It's translating our JSX code, which the browser doesn't understand, into vanilla JavaScript and HTML. That's what React does, right? And React has use state and all of that kind of stuff. But what we're going to do is we're going to run npm start. That is firing up our server on port 3000 so that when we modify our code over here, we can see it change in our browser. There are other npm commands that you will learn how to run, like npm build, which will build your development code into a production version that you'll be able to deploy.
Also, I wanted to point out something that Caitlin taught me is if you ever get rid of your React app on Google Chrome, like if you're ever to like exit, you can always command and then click on the local under the terminal, the local address.
Oh, that's a good trick. So if you're in your terminal, just like when we were up in our code, and if we wanted to jump to app.css, we don't need to open it manually over here. If we hold in command and click on it, it will actually open that file for us. The same goes for the URLs down here. If you click on the URLs, they don't do anything. But if you hold in command and click on localhost 3000, it will actually open that up in your browser for you.
I thought it was a neat trick.
It sure is. And the old school grandpa way that I always do it is I lose tabs all the time. And so all I do is go into the URL and type in localhost 3000 and hit enter. And that also brings us back to where we're at. There are some keyboard shortcuts that you learn and then you're just mad that it took you that long to learn them. That's one. Okay. So now we're going to set up our router. Before we can set up our router, we need to have something to route to, right? We need two different pages. So I'm going to call mine home.js because you almost always have a home page no matter what project you're creating. Not always, but usually. I'm just going to create one called page 2 because I'm not creative enough to come up with a new name. So on our home page, we need to make a component. And the way we make a component is the same way we make a function in JavaScript. The only difference is that we always have to return something out of the component, and whatever component we create has to start with a capital letter. If it doesn't start with a capital letter, React will get confused and think that we're talking about HTML instead of a React component. So how do we make a component? We say const home. We do an equals with our parentheses. We do our curly braces. That looks just like a function or an arrow function to me. And then we have to return something out of it. And we can return anything. Commonly, we return a div. But if we didn't want to return a div, we could just return an H1 that says homepage if we wanted to. It doesn't matter what we return there as long as we're only returning one component or HTML element. From there, we need to give our app access to importing this. So before we can import it, we've got to export it. And we're going to say, hey, the default thing that we're exporting here is our home component. So this home means this home right here. They line up directly. We're going to do that same exact thing over on our page 2. I'm going to say const page 2 equals some component, some function that's going to return out an H1 that has page 2 on it. And then we're going to export our default page 2. Any questions on that? We haven't done any routing yet. We just created our components that we could route to. Okay. Moving right along here. So now we're in our app and we've got to set up our router before we use it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import 3 things. I'm going to import browser router, routes, and route from React Router DOM. That is linking us between the code that we're writing and the code that React Router DOM has for us. So because we ran npm install and had React Router DOM in it, now we can use it in here. If we skip that install step and just started importing things, we would get an error immediately in our terminal that says React Router DOM is not installed. I don't know how to do that. So the install step is what allows us to start importing from that package. Now we set up our router by using 2 tags, our browser router and our routes. This is what's allowing us to switch between the 2 pages. Now, whenever we have a component, whether it's home or page 2 or whatever it is, that we want to be on its own page or its own route or its own URL, all saying the same thing there, we need to make a new route for it. So the first route we're going to make is going to have the path of /. That's going to be our home page, right? We don't need to type in home at the end of it. We want it so when people go to localhost, just go to this page. And the element that is going to be linked to it is our home component. The problem is it doesn't know what home is. So the second I save this file, it's like home is not defined. What you talking about, Willis? There's no home here. What we need to do is go up to the top and import our home from our home file.
That was great, Max. Thank you for that. I appreciated that personally.
Good laugh at 6:20 at night never hurts.
I grew up on that show. Oh my God.
So we've got our home here. Now we can kind of see how this all links together. Our home, and I'm sorry if you guys get seasick when I do all of my lines on the screen, but it's what helps me understand it. We've got our home here. That's linked to our path in the browser. That home is coming from our import of home, which is coming from the home file, which is coming from our home.js, which we happen to have open over here, which is going to our export, which is getting home from up here, which is ultimately going to show up this H1 here. And that's not just how I understand it. That's what the computer is doing under the hood. That is how it's all linking together. That's how it's understanding. So we're going to do one more route. I'm going to leave that on the screen in case you're still studying. I'm going to do a route to my path. And just as an example here, oftentimes our routes are related to whatever page we're linking to, but they don't really have to be. So I could link it to, I don't know, sleep, because that's what we seem to be getting all day. And that is going to come from our page 2 component. Now I happen to have autocomplete work in my favor there. So when I hit the enter button on the autocomplete, look at what slipped in up here at the top. It did my import for me. If it doesn't, no big deal. We write it from hand. So we do our page 2, everything's linked here. But for whatever reason, I called this sleet. So to show you how all of that works, clear this, go back to my browser. Now I've got my home page. But if I want to get to my page 2, what I now need to do, I can't just go to page 2. That doesn't work. It's empty. Page 2 doesn't exist. What does exist is my route called sleet. why can I use Sleet up here and make it to my page 2? Because the only thing the browser cares about is the path here. What the router is doing is linking my path here to my component that happens to be called page 2.
This might be a weird question, but can you name, obviously I'm guessing you can name paths, anything?
Pretty much.
Okay.
Paths with spaces in them aren't usually a good idea. Paths with emoji in them are not a great idea. Although that is, believe it or not, becoming more of a thing that is supported in browsers. There are some limits to what you can call a path, but for the most part, yeah, you can go crazy on a path and call it whatever you want.
Okay, thank you.
Oftentimes, it's common to see categories of paths. So let's say you had a teacher, and if you went to /teacher, it would show you all the teachers in the school, but you could go to /teacher/Matthews, and it would show you all of the students that I have. And there may be /teacher/Matthews and /teacher/Warboard, right? And then you would see all of Caitlin's students. So it is common to see multiple slashes, but it's like further breaking down whatever that category is.
Mm-hmm. So if you can go back to the app.js all the way at the top, I see that you have the the import app.css. So do you import other CSS files in there if you're going to be using them?
Yeah, so if I make a new file called pretty.css, and I say, hey, go find my H1 and make the color red.
Mm-hmm.
When I come over here, I don't have a red H1. If I go back to my homepage, I don't have a red H1 because we need to import our pretty. So if I save that, now I've got a red H1.
Gotcha. Okay.
And it doesn't matter if we import it here or if we say, nope, just kidding, pretty wasn't supposed to be part of my app. It was supposed to be part of my homepage. So we can also import pretty over here. However, you would think by doing that, our pretty would only apply to this H1 in here. And unfortunately, it doesn't. If I go to page 2, if I go to Sleet, because I just confused myself, we still have a red H1 over there. So what we talked about yesterday is how do we fix that using a upgrade to CSS called Sass. So if I go over and I rename my pretty.css and I do SCSS instead, I normally couldn't do this unless I had installed Sass first. So out of the box, React does not support Sass, but as soon as you do npm install, it's like, I'm prepared for your Sass, just lay it on me. So we install Sass, we use the file extension Sass, and then in our imports, we also have to make sure the S is part of it. So now what we can do is we can say, hey, I'm going to put an ID on this that says home. And I'm going to change this to a div just so it's a little bit easier to understand. Div, and then move this into an H1 and move homepage over into that. Okay, so we've got our homepage and we've got our page 2, both of which have an H1 on it. But what I want to do is I want to say, hey, I have an H1, I've got an H2, that's an example, and I've got a p tag. So what I want to do is say, hey, when I'm in pretty.scss, I want all of this CSS to only apply to the home ID. So unless the H1, H2, or P tag at some point have a parent div with an ID of home, don't apply the CSS that is inside pretty. So what that does is now I'm on page 2. I don't have a red H1, but if I go back to my home page, now I've got my red showing up. So that means whatever styling I put between this opening and closing curly brace, which we can't use without having SAS installed and using the SAS file extension, now that I've got all of that set up, I can apply whatever I want here. So I can do my color green. And even if I take that exact same stuff and put it on my page 2, now when I go to my page 2, I don't have that SAS applied. None of that answers your question, Exona, which I totally booted to today, which is, okay, but what if I wanted to apply to 2 different pages, but not all of my other pages? What if I've got a login page and a sign up page, and those 2 pages share the same styles? I want to have one CSS file that applies to both of them. Well, what I would do is in my page 2, even though I already have it imported in home, because I want the CSS styling to apply to this one as well, I would still import my pretty.scss just as a safety measure, just in case for whatever reason home didn't get loaded. I still applied my pretty here. But then what I do over in my div, I add an ID called page 2 in here. And now I say, hey, I want this not only to apply to the home div, but also to page 2. And now when we come over, we've got our styling over here.
Okay. I'm just trying to think of, like, I'm going to be using the nav bar for all of my pages, obviously. So I'm trying to think of ways to how I'm going to implement the nav bar with the CSS in all of the pages.
So you don't need to apply that to our nav bar. So if we make a navbar component and import navbar.css everywhere, whatever is in that navbar CSS will get carried over to whatever pages we import.
Okay.
So you don't need to say, so what I would do is I would make my navbar JS, I would make my navbar.css, or if you want to get fancy, SCSS, I would make my const navbar and say I'm going to return out a div. That div is going to have an ahref to Google and to, I don't know, Apple. Now, if I wanted to style those A tags, I would go to my navbar.scss and say, hey, all my A tags are going to be fuchsia. And then I'm going to go back to my navbar and import my navbar. It'd help if I had quotes. Navbar.scss. Now I can say, hey, I want to use my navbar in my page 2. No, I can't. Export default navbar. And then use my navbar over here. And for good measure, now that I've got my navbar.scss imported, all of my A tags anywhere on my site are going to be fuchsia. I'm like, okay, maybe I didn't want to do that. So what I'm going to do in here is add an ID called nav. Then I'm going to go to my navbar.scss and put this whole thing in something called nav. But that won't impact an A tag that I have here
on page 2.
On page 2, even though I'm calling it navbar which is not only returning all of this stuff, but it's importing my SCSS, which has my A as fuchsia, but only things in my nav ID.
Okay.
So
So you
now when I
just have
come
to
over,
specify
yes,
by using the hashtag, by using the ID.
by using the ID or any selector. But what SAS allows us to do is say only apply to A tags that have an ID of nav somewhere.
Okay. Okay. No, I understand it. I get it. I'm just thinking in my mind, like, how am I going to do that with the code that I already have? So, perfect. Thank you. This is helpful.
So oftentimes we would put navbar in its own folder called lib. And lib is like components. It's a library of things that we reference in a lot of different places. Because you don't want to put your navbar in a folder called home and then realize you need to access your navbar in other folders. So because of that, you're always going into the home folder to get your navbar. And it's like, all right, well, that would work, but it's better to have components that are going to be used on multiple pages off in their own folder called lib, kind of towards the top, which would theoretically make them easier to import.
Okay.
Exona,
Yeah.
it would help. But when I started doing my project, I started importing one at a time. Like time, I created all the components for the pages themselves, if they were repeated pages, and then I created my SCSS file and made sure that I put the ID on that, and importing the other pages that are the same, and I'm just importing in the content of it, then they were linking automatically to the CSS page, so I could see it updating automatically as it was going into the project.
Okay.
I didn't get confused about putting a ID or a class or anything like that, just to keep it apart. So if you have something that's all working together that has one CSS page that you want it to work, then create the CSS page, the SCSS page first, putting the first page with that ID, or creating the component with that ID. That way, what information you put in there is already linked to that CSS page. So you could actually start seeing the project actually applying the CSS.
Right. No, yeah, thank you. No, I have to. I have no choice but to do all literally that, because I will get lost. I have about, I'm not joking, probably like 20 files already, 30.
And that's okay. The React code that I work in at work probably has, I don't know, what would you say, Caitlin, 1,000, 500, something like that. So our folder structure is really, really important, right?
Yeah.
But when Caitlin started to work with us, right, she got in and wasn't like, oh my God, 500 files, how am I ever going to understand this? That's a common thing. And the reason why I want to bring that up in class is because when you get hired to work at a company, chances are they're not going to say, here, go build this, and you start from scratch and get to decide your own framework and your own language and your own all of that stuff. Chances are you're going to come into a project that the company has been working on for several months or even several years, right? And so one of my favorite interview questions, and we will have mock interviews starting in a couple and probably 2 months. One of my favorite mock interview questions is, how would you go about understanding a new project with an existing code base? And my answer to that is, I push the code aside and I go learn how to use whatever the code is, right? I go say, all right, I'm working on this college admission site. Let me understand how I navigate this site as a user. Oh, okay, there's a nav bar in a couple different places, and that nav bar is the same. Note to self, go find that in the code and figure out how that's all linked up. Okay, great. Now I'm on my homepage. Let me go find my homepage and figure out how all of that is working. Okay, great. Now I click on this college and I get more information about the college. Where does that come from? And you're looking at the code and you're like, nowhere does this say average GPA 3.5. And so then I would start pulling that apart and going, oh, look, there's an API call here. Where is that API call going? Do I have access to that API code? How does that get from the database, right? Now I'm going a little more full stacky than what we have covered so far, but we will work our way up to that level, right? And so oftentimes when you start working on a new project, you don't have to understand how to create a route from scratch, because you can already go to app.js or routes.js that already exists, or pages.js or whatever they end up calling it, and say, oh, there are already 50 different routes in here. So if I want to make my own route in my own page, doesn't even matter if they're not using React, I know that I can follow their format to make a new route work. And so oftentimes you just want to follow along. And that's why we say, yes, we happen to be teaching you React, but if you use Angular or Vue or Django or Ruby on Rails, or they all have the notion of routes. Sure, the syntax isn't going to be exactly the same, and they may call it an href instead of a to, or they may call it path, or they may, right? Like, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, because you've got in your head, hey, whenever I've got a component that I want to show up as its own entirely separate page, I make a new route, I make the page for that, I make the file for that, I put in some empty placeholder to make sure it shows up, I go change my URL to that in the browser, it shows up, great, now I'm good to go. What else do I need? Oh, I need a nav bar, but that nav bar has been built by someone else already on the team. So let me go to another page that has that nav bar, let me see how they got that nav bar working, and then I'll just steal that code over. Okay, now I've got my page structure done. How do I build out what I need to now from scratch?
Gotcha. So you're thinking of it more of, let me see what the end user sees and does, and if something is missing, let me go find out how I can fix that.
And more importantly, let me go find out if that feature is anywhere else on the website already, and if it is, I can reference that to build it into here.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Thank you.
And if it's not built in this project, let me go think back to Careers in Code cohort 4 and figure out when we covered that in the curriculum and rewatch that video, and then I can figure out how to put it into this project.
I'm so glad you have that list, that calendar.
Believe it or not, that was not part of cohort 1, and I don't know if we had it as part of cohort 2, and I had a light bulb moment of like, well, we're doing our whole instructor scheduling, why don't we just link to the outline, the video, and the transcript right in there, and then it becomes much easier to go back and reference it. So that was a cohort 2.5 or 3 edition, where it was like, oh, cross-linking all of this stuff is a pain to do it every day, but once it's done, now you can always go back and then be like, I don't have time for the video, let me just go search through the transcript and see if the word router is talked about or something like that.
Makes sense. Thank you.
No problem. Schneider, did you want to go over custom hooks, or did that article make sense to you?
Yeah, but I still want your 2 cents on it.
Okay. So Schneider had a question. Are there any other questions on this stuff before I move on to one other topic? And
no,
then second,
can you post that zip file?
Yep.
On Slack, just so that we can have it as a template.
1 second to do that, because you know I will totally forget unless I do it right now. I don't need to send that to Caitlin. Here we go. Okay, so Schneider had a question on, hey, hooks are cool and all, and we used hooks for use state, use effect, use params, use navigate. Those were all things that we could kind of hook into existing functionality, whether it's coming from React or the router or some other package we have installed. But hey, wouldn't it be cool if we could write our own hook? So believe it or not, React does not have a way to say, hey, I want to get the size of the window. Maybe I want to say, hey, if the window is too tiny, put up a message that says, hey, our application wasn't designed for mobile, or maybe we want to say, whoa, what a big monitor you have there if we get up to a 28-inch monitor or something like that, right? Well, the thing is that we want that to update whenever the window size changes. We can actually do that in JavaScript, but we can't do it in native React. So what we end up doing is we end up creating our own hook that we're able to use in different files. So the way we do that is we create a new SRC file, and we're going to call this use window width.js. Traditionally, hooks start with the word use. They don't necessarily have to. In here, we're going to do our standard const use window width. And notice I don't have a capital U at the beginning of that. That's because this is not a component. This isn't something that's going to get shown to the end user. It's something we're going to reference in some other code. In this hook, we are able to define what we want our hook to do. So what we do is we say, hey, when this hook is first called, we use an effect. We also want to keep track of our window width and our set window width. And our window width is going to start out at 0. Then, now that we've got our use effect, we said, hey, when this first loads, we are going to use regular JavaScript here. The regular JavaScript we're going to use is window add event listener for a resize. And when that resize happens, set window width to our window dot inner width. Now, this would be a lot of code to put on every single time that we wanted our window width. If we wanted our window width in a bunch of different components, this is a whole heck of a lot of code to put on each one. But because we define this in its own file, what we're able to do is say import use window width, and then const width equals our use window width. And then down in our page, we can actually say something like width is equal to our width. So I come over here and I make sure my React is started. Use state is not defined because why would it be? Forgot to import it. And now that's going to make a little liar out of me and not work. Window, add event listener. Oh, you know what I have to do? I have to return my window width. So now it's 513. And I come and I expand it. And you see it goes up to 844. I can shrink this down and it goes back down to whatever the width of that is. So basically, what that hook is doing is the hook is returning some value. That value is usually stored in state. It's something that's live updating. But this is a way we can kind of extract out all of the work that we had to do to get JavaScript to keep track of the state. We made our own hook called use window width. Then we did whatever we needed to do so that the value would update. In this case, we happen to use window add event listener, not always the case. But because of all the work that we did over here, now whenever we want to access width, it is going to be updated because use window width is a hook. We're hooking into the functionality that we just built over here. And usually hooks are built to automatically update when some value or some data changes. Not always, but usually. Does that explain the article a little bit better, Schneider, or does that answer your question?
Yep. 2 birds with 1 stone. Thank you.
Good. Creating your own custom hook. I feel like that's something that I should use more often as a good React developer. It is a good way to extract things out, but in my entire professional React career, hooks did not exist for that whole time. Hooks only came out maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Believe it or not, that means use state and use effect did not exist in the first versions of React. In fact, we actually use a class-based component instead of a function-based component. And because of that, all of that React code changes a little bit. I can show you an example of what a class-based React component is, just so you guys have some exposure to it. But it's been so long that I've created one that I actually have to go look at the documentation, because it's been a hot minute since I've made one. Okay, so a class-based component still supported by React, they can be intermixed, but it's just a totally different way of making your own component. So I'm going to call this one, I don't know, egg.js. No idea where I'm coming up with these names. Please don't ask. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to say there's a new class. A class is kind of a grouping of all of your code, of all of your functions together. That class is going to be called egg. And then we say it extends. In other words, it is bringing in some functionality that already exists. It extends a React component. Then instead of just being able to return things out, we actually have to have this method called render. And render is what's going to return our content. In this case, it's going to be a div. All of this JSX inside the render is still the same. This, I'm going to say button has been clicked 0 times, and then I'm going to make the button that says click me. Now, instead of just being able to throw our functions above this return, we have to make it its own thing. So we have to say button clicked, and then we use state entirely differently as well. We say, hey, this dot state starts out with the counter at 0. And whenever, is it just state? Just start with that state. That might be it. Then whenever we want to update this, we add our on click called button clicked. And we say this dot set state my counter to whatever this dot state dot counter is +1. Then we access all of that by going into our app and making a new route path for our egg called element that says go get my egg component, which I think I also have to export my default egg. Egg is not defined. Do I not need to export it? No, I need to import it. And I also need to import React from React. Button clicked. Caitlin, I'm freezing up. What do I use for that function? Do I have to declare it as a function here? It's been so long since I've written a class-based component.
Same. I think you do more class-based than I do.
To be clear, this is like old code, right? Like you won't see this.
It's older than function based, but you still see it.
Yes. So that's a very important question. This is definitely considered old school. However, this was used for years and years, and a lot of companies won't spend time updating their old code. They just say, hey, any new code we're writing, we're going to write with the newer functional component, to the point where this is our very last day of React. And this is something that I'm covering because if you saw this, you'd be like, that ain't React. That's not how we write components, right? And it's like, well, yes, this is technically still React. It's just an older syntax. It's an older way of creating a component. This is called a class-based component. Everything that we learned is the newer way, which is called a function or functional component. But now I'm really mad because it's something with like and then does this need to go in a constructor? And then I get access to this. Not allowed before super.
Oh God.
No. Damn it. It burns. The old way burns. Handle click. No, it should have just been this. And then
I think it's you don't need a bind, right?
no, I think I needed the arrow function. Now it's mad on line 20.
That.
Oh, damn it, Max. Okay.
I was gonna say the button clicked function looks right.
And I think this will work now. The problem was that I wasn't actually referencing state in the return.
You have an extra curly brace.
Yeah. Oh, and then this can't be past the call. It's got to be past the function. Nope, that broke it. Go back to the old school way. Retreat, retreat, run away, run away. Okay. Sorry for the detour there. That took me a minute. This is the old school way of writing a React component. This is called a class-based component. What we do is we declare the class. The class is just a grouping of functions or code together. When you use classes in something called object-oriented programming. If object-oriented programming does not ring a bell, that's something worth Googling over your break. There are several programming languages like Java and usually Python that use classes in order to organize their code. This is a class-based component. What we do is we use a constructor. Constructor is used when the class is first set up to say, what do the initial values start out as? we use this super function in order to call in whatever the construction is from the component we're extending. Then we set our initial values in state up here. Whenever we reference state, instead of using set state, we instead use this dot set state, and then we pass in whatever values we're trying to update. Our on click, instead of just being able to call this function directly, we have to say this dot button clicked so it knows where it's looking for the button clicked function. And then instead of using some value that's getting returned from state, we have to use this dot state dot counter or this dot state dot whatever the variable name is. So this is a good example of you're looking at this code and you're like, all right, I kind of get it, right? Like I could write this as a functional component and it would all work the same, but this is an entirely different syntax. This is the old school way of doing it. About 4 years ago, I hired a team of 3 other developers, and they came in and they said, old man, stop it with your class-based components. We write functional components. And I went, no, class-based components make more sense. Functional sucks. I'll never learn that. And then 6 months later, I went, okay, fine. This is better. I'll switch over to teaching that. And writing all of my code in it. And now our entire code base is all function-based components. However, the reason why I spend a couple minutes on this is there is a lot of older React code that you'll see that is not converted over to a functional component yet. And sometimes you'll read a Medium article or watch a YouTube video, and they'll start writing the code out like this. And you're like, whoa, what is that? This is the old school way of writing a component. It still works. React still supports it. However, I just like to preface this and say, hey, I'm checking off a box here. I exposed you to this. So if you see code that looks like this is all still React. It's just a different way of making a component work. And the one feature that made functional components work, is hooks. Once React released a way to use state and use effect, the 2 most important and widely used hooks, once React had that feature working, they encouraged everyone to switch over to functional components, and almost any new code today is written as a functional component. But that's not to say that at some point in your coding career, you won't be exposed to a class-based component, just like you'll see var in some old JavaScript code instead of let and const. You'll also see class-based components in React. Does anyone have questions on this old school, old man way of writing this component? Someone want to
place compared to use state and use effect?
Yeah, hindsight being 2020, I really regret holding on to this. This made a lot more sense to me because this is the way that I learn React, and learning anything new is always hard. But I will freely admit that I was wrong and that functional-based components make a lot more sense. But that's not to say that you won't be exposed to something like this. All right, that's all I've got for you. Go on break, be back at 7:25.
Just for funsies, are you aware of the whole what's it called, router drilling thing, where you deeply nest the routers and stuff like that?
I am. I'm not the hugest fan of it. However, there is some value in being able to make one kind of structure.js page and have your navbar and your sidebar and your footer and whatever else in it, and then have routes work inside of that page.
Yeah, a friend who's like way far ahead of me in this whole coding thing was like, he was helping me out and he introduced that to me. I was like, what the hell is this? I ain't never seen this before.
Yeah, it's not something that I would teach to the whole class. but it is a very legitimate feature that, believe it or not, only came out in React Router about a year ago. But it's definitely something that if you are interested in, it's worth reading the docs. And then if you need help with it, I can help in a one-on-one.
Okay, I'll look into it more because I feel like it could probably speed up the whole thing for me. Thank you.
Just be careful while it's probably valuable to have like a structure page and have like your nav bar on everything. It can get very tricky in the configuration of the routes in order to get it to work the way you want.
All right, I'll keep that in mind.
Artrell, go ahead.
All right. So questions pertaining to my capstone. There's a couple of websites I look at. I see some things on I think are cool, and I probably want to incorporate in mine. I just want to make sure I'm not being overly ambitious.
Okay.
So I want to send feedback. I could touch base on it with you, and if you feel it's something we should do in a one-on-one, we could totally do that. But at least, I guess bring it to your attention.
Sure.
All right. May I share my screen?
Hopefully the update fixed it.
All right. I think it did. Let's give it a shot. All right. Can you see my screen?
I can.
All right. So I like how Macy's website, like when you hover over like a word, it'll expand out.
Yep.
And like that, for example. And I kind of want to do that on mine. So when I did the inspect, it brought me down to like this area here.
Yep.
Now like the fobs and all that, some of those IDs, obviously I'm not familiar with, but I guess we can name it almost whatever we want to, but.
So what I would redirect you to is that this is totally feasible and already built into Bootstrap. So instead of trying to implement the functionality directly, instead, I'm going to point you at request remote.
Okay.
And I'm going to go to the Bootstrap documentation. So the nice thing about the Bootstrap documentation is it works. You can kind of see like an example of it, and then they show you the exact code that makes it work. So if we go down to our nav bar, you'll see they've got this example here. And if you click on this drop down, it should show you this little drop down. So we can adjust that to make that work on hover instead of on click. But this is a similar approach to what you're going for.
Awesome. All right. So that's one.
Mm-hmm.
Second thing.
One thing I'll throw out for you and for the whole class, if you're like, yeah, that does the same thing, Max, but I don't like the way it looks, or I want to learn how to build that from scratch. I don't want to use Bootstrap. That is totally legitimate pushback. Most of the time you want to say, hey, someone else already built this. If I follow their instructions, I can get it working on mine. But every now and then there are times that you say, no, I want more control over this, or I really want to understand how this is working, or even though it's going to take me an hour, I want to learn how to do that. That's totally fine pushback, and we can do that in a one-on-one. That might not be the case for you, but just want to throw that out there for other students as well.
All right. And one other thing. So the tab you have open right now, if you go 2 tabs over, if you can click on that since you still have control.
Oh, you have control too. You can always override me, but
I like this the motion of the shape, and below I see it's a G tag. Should I even check? Is that too ambitious? You can say yes.
Yes. A reluctant yes.
Okay.
I would say if you were focused on front end design only, it is worth learning how to use CSS animations. And so one of the when we were doing the vanilla JavaScript version of our portfolio, and we had our kind of our words fade in, that is the preferred way of doing animations in CSS. There is a older way of doing it where you basically run some JavaScript code on over a period of time, and that's what animates it. And then to further complicate this G tag is actually in this SVG. SVG stands for Scalable Vector Graphic. It's basically, instead of having every pixel have a certain color assigned to it, instead a vector graphic actually has the lines and the paths that it takes to make that graphic. And the benefit of that is that it is scalable. So if you have it as a vector, because it's point A and point B, and whatever we do with that fill, you could literally take that vector graphic and throw it up on a billboard, and it would look the same resolution as if you had it on a tiny little business card. And so what they're doing here is they are animating a vector graphic either through CSS animation or through JavaScript animation. That may be a little ambitious to do yourself, but I will provide you an alternative, just like I did for the nav bar, which is if you Google CSS animations or CSS animation examples, oftentimes they will have pre-written code that will get your animation working. And those are typically open sourced licensed. So while it would technically be illegal to take the code off this site and use it in your own, oftentimes when there is an example published, that is something that you are allowed to get away with.
Okay. Now, quick sidebar question. Why would it be illegal to use theirs if I tweaked it for my own logo? Is it proprietary?
Not that it's proprietary, it's that it's copyrighted. So all websites fall under the same copywriting laws because when you deploy a website, legal lawyers have determined, or judges or someone, I'm not offering legal advice. This is not the opinion of Hack Upstate or any of my employers, blah, 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 blah. But basically, whenever you put a website up on the internet, they have determined that that is the equivalent of publishing. So if you write an entire book and sell it on Amazon, you don't actually have to go get a copyright for that book and register the book. Because you published it, it is considered protected and you own that copyright. So it would be like if I took a textbook and Xeroxed it all together and started selling that myself. Well, I'm paying for the paper. I paid for the textbook. Why am I not allowed to do that? Because it's copyrighted, right? Those words are owned by the author or the publisher or whoever owns them. And so the same goes for website code. Is if it's licensed, to go back to Jay's talk with open source, in a way that is encouraging for you to use it, the license is basically the modification to the copyright. It is saying, hey, this is how you're allowed to use this code. You're allowed to use React, but you've got to put a disclaimer somewhere that you're using React and you link back to us. Or you're allowed to use React, but you're not allowed to use React in a commercial project that's going to make money. This isn't the case for React. React is pretty liberal in their licensing, but it's just like an image, right? I don't have permission to just take this image and use it because I'm not the photographer of it. I'm actually not allowed to record this image and have it as part of our video. However, there's an exception for fair use. And fair use says, because this is used for education and because we're not using this to turn a profit on it, or the only profit we're turning on it is tuition dollars, that says we are allowed to use it. but even fair use has bounds of saying, hey, I can't go take someone else's 3-hour YouTube video, play that instead, and then say, hey, this is Hack Upstate's content. Well, that's fair use. It's for education. They say, yeah, but you're only allowed to use a certain percentage of it or make it a certain percentage of your class. So if YouTube came to us and said, not allowed to have this in your video, this is copyrighted, we could actually not fight it, but file a ticket with them and say, no, this is fair use because even though that song is copyrighted, I'm the one who wrote that song. Or even though I'm using my own code in the video, I'm the one who wrote that code, so I hold the copyright to it. And 9 times out of 10, YouTube will say, okay, our bad, totally allowed, just go for it. But that's why whenever we watch a YouTube video in class, I always pause the recording, play the video for you guys, and then resume the recording. I'm allowed to do that, but I'm not allowed to claim it as my own content unless I have the explicit permission of the copyright holder, which is why we also go to Unsplash all the time instead of going to Google Images and picking a random image. I go to Unsplash so that I know that I'm allowed to use that image.
Okay.
Sorry, that was a very long rant on some very boring legal copyright, but you can definitely get in trouble for using other people's code unless it is licensed or unless you have their permission.
Fair. That's why I clicked it back over to Bootstrap while we were talking. No,
oh, you're fine. That totally falls under fair use. And that's something that, I mean, I'm on websites all the time, right? I pull up the Bootstrap documentation when I'm sharing my screen, or I go to NPM, or all of that is allowed under fair use. Where it gets a little trickier is, hey, I'm playing some song in the background while we're coding. Well, that isn't technically required for the education of our class. And so now you fall under, that's not really fair use.
Right. Got it.
Sorry, you didn't know you were asking a legal question, but it's something that I happen to be well practiced in the answer of.
Which I'm happy you are, because I was going to see, if you would have said, give it a shot, I would have tried it, and you would have been like, oh, hold up.
So you can find, like, if you even get specific, for whatever reason, I find Google to be better than any other search engine because they're more developer-y focused. Their algorithm, for whatever reason, does a better job at pulling apart what the code is actually doing to match it to your search query. But if you did some search for CSS animation logo bubble, you might not find that exact effect, but you may find something that you like even more, or that's pretty close. And then that's what I would give a shot at implementing.
Okay. And I think that's it for now, Max. I'm gonna try to get a one-on-one with you on Sunday.
Cool. And as always, this goes for the whole class. If I don't have any one-on-ones available, you are more than welcome to shoot me a Slack message. I only have my calendar open up for mornings on the weekends, but as we get focused more and more on capstones, those slots will fill up. So if you're trying to meet with me in the next couple days and there's just nothing that works with your schedule, shoot me a Slack message and also include a couple times that work for you. And we can probably get something booked manually.
Okay.
And I forgot to mention, now that we're in the open study hall portion of class, if you want to turn off your camera, that's totally fine. Caitlin, did you grab attendance already? Cool. Then yeah, you're welcome to turn your cameras off and just get heads down and working.
Hey,
or leave the meeting as well if I'm distracting you.
To your point on the lack of freedom of control when you use Bootstrap, can you do like an external, or rather another CSS sheet and then link it so it can override Bootstrap? Or because
you most certainly can. Where it gets a little trickier, yeah, you definitely can do you basically cascade over the Bootstrap style sheet, right? That's why it's called CSS, because you can cascade over existing styles, overwrite existing styles. You most certainly can do that. Bootstrap is totally cool with that. You know, when you're like, oh, I just don't like the font that Bootstrap uses, or I want to change the size of that, or whatever it is. put some more margin or padding on. All of that's totally fair game. Where it gets a little trickier is when you have some interactive element where you're like, oh, I want to make that drop down show up on hover instead of on click. Well, now we not only have to change the CSS, we also have to potentially change the JavaScript. And the JavaScript is where it gets a little dicier overriding Bootstrap. So there is always an argument to be had of, does it make more sense to start with Bootstrap and kind of hack it together and override it? Or does it make more sense to build it from scratch where we have to build it from the ground up? But because we're doing that, we have a lot more control over the whole process. And that answer is different, not only for every developer, but every situation, right? Where sometimes, oh yeah, it's just, I don't want that border to be rounded. I want it to be square. Okay, just override Bootstrap, no big deal. But when you get into, oh, I want 6 levels of a drop-down menu where you can go into this one and then you can go into this one. And I also need to put a search input in that 3rd level of the drop-down menu. And I also want to include images in it. Okay, well, now at that point, it actually might be better to build it custom than it would be to build it from Bootstrap.
Thank you.
We have front-end web developer, and whenever they build anything, straight CSS, right? They don't use Bootstrap. They didn't even use a grid system, which blew my mind. They wrote everything in vanilla CSS, and I look at the CSS and I can read it, and I have no idea how they can have the organizational skills in order to be able to write that CSS. But it's beautiful. And on the front end, you just use these classes and they just magically work. I am not at that skill level. I call that a CSS wizard. And the fact of the matter is you're either a CSS wizard or you're not. If you go into CSS and feel like you can write that as a second language, you're a CSS wizard. I am not a CSS wizard. I can fix your Bootstrap. I can do a little tweaks to margin and padding, but I don't know design principles behind everything. So I am someone who starts at Bootstrap or a framework like Material UI, and builds all of my interfaces on top of that and then tweaks the colors. But there is a whole field of not only programmatic front-end website development in CSS, but an entirely separate job title of UI design, where they use a tool like Figma or Sketch or whatever it is. Photoshop's the older school way of doing it to design that entire interface. And while I can do the Tesla car exercise with you guys on week 1, I can't dive into the level of, oh, well, you should make your margins either 20 or 40 pixels because the theory of math says that when they're divisible by whatever. I can't do all of that level stuff. One of these days, you guys are going to ask me a question that I can actually answer in a sentence instead of a 4-hour paragraph ramble.
The extra information sometimes helps.
So for Mondays,
capstone check-in?
Yeah, capstone check-in. Like, what do we need necessarily?
So you're gonna want to share your screen. You're gonna want to have at least 2 pages done with route set up to the components. You're gonna want to have some content on at least 2 different pages. The pages don't need to be finished. They don't need to have any functionality. The forms don't need to work. We just want to see 2 pages, at least 2 pages created, some links between them, the route set up, some styling done on them, okay. And then share your code as well and say, hey, this is how it's coming along. This is how I organize my files, even if it's just 3 files, just a little glimpse of this is what I have so far on a couple different pages, and this is how it's working under the hood.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Some people will be further along than others. That's okay. But we want to see, hey, I'm taking all the concepts I've learned in React. I'm getting comfortable with my JS. I've got my router set up, and I'm starting to feel like my project is becoming a little bit more real in the code and actually working. And I actually have, I'm going to regret saying this because I'm going to open my calendar tomorrow morning and go, whoa, where did all of these come from? But I do have a lot of open spaces on Friday. I know that might not work with everyone's workday and schedule, but if you want to grab a one-on-one, I do have availability tomorrow.
Something I can see.
I will. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh no, I insist you go first.
I was gonna ask about API stuff. Emailing the right people or try and get in contact with the people that I need for the APIs for the charging and stuff. I don't really know how to go about that.
Normally it just starts with the Google search, right? So API reporting charging rates, right? And sometimes you may want to integrate with someone directly, like Tesla in the Tesla app. Actually, not even in the app. On the Tesla touchscreen in the car, you can see the charging rates of a supercharger, but they don't have that API open to the public. In other words, they have some API that the cars can use to get the charging information, but Tesla doesn't allow consumers or third-party app developers to get access to that data by applying for an API key. However, you usually can find some API that will achieve the same thing, right? So you might be able to find an API that reports all the Tesla supercharging locations, but not necessarily the charging rates. Or you may find, hey, I can't get it for Tesla, but EVgo is another one, or ChargePoint, or I can go to some other network and they may have an API available with that charging information.
Go ahead, Jordan. Thank you.
And that's also another great use of a one-on-one. If you can't find the data or you find an API and you can't get that API working, we can definitely tag team that together and see if we can put two heads are better than one kind of thing. Go ahead, Jordan. Sorry, cut you off enough times.
No, it's okay. I was actually looking at your Calendly right now.
Yep.
Like I said, I probably won't be able to. I don't know about class right now on Monday. Just especially with the storm that's coming in. It might be delayed. I might have time to be able to do it from like the airport and everything. But if I did work on it with you tomorrow, I haven't worked on anything since last time, but I have been coding my ass off with HTML and CSS. So I feel like I'm going to whip through a large portion of it either tonight or tomorrow.
Sure.
It would probably just be double checking if
Yeah,
anything.
that's fine.
Okay, cool.
You'll want to take a stab at getting the React project set up and starting to move things over into React.
Yeah.
But that's a totally valid use of a one-on-one. If you're like, hey, can we just do the React setup together and get the first 2 pages? I try and structure my one-on-one so not only do you feel accomplished with the goal that you came in with, but you know what to work on next.
Yeah.
And so we can totally do that.
React. Yeah. No offense. It's just that because like I said before, since I had missed that first hour that week of every class that we had that Monday through Thursday, I have been rewatching the videos. It doesn't help, but Free Code Academy does. Good. So you know what I'm saying? Like I've been going through that and that's been reinforcing my knowledge in it and like making me more confident to do it on my own. But the videos do not, because sometimes you guys will be saying stuff and I'm like, where did that come from? So
it's interesting that you mentioned Free Code Camp for React. One of our TAs went through the Free Code Camp on React and was vehemently opposed to us using that as a resource because she was like, I am so confused by this. I have no idea what they're trying to teach me. I hated React until I went to the React documentation and that's what made it click for me. So sometimes you find a resource that you look at it and you're like, all right, I get what they're going for, but this isn't for me. Or you're looking at it and you're like, all right, I'm not really getting it, but if I spend more time on it, it will click. Those are in the center of the spectrum. And then the other end of the spectrum is, what the fuck are they talking about? I'm so confused. I'm never going to learn this. Or, oh my God, this is so much better than what Max was talking about. This makes way more sense to me. And it seems like the free code camp on React is at those polar opposite ends of the spectrum of you either really get it or you really don't.
I think it's being able to read their explanation first, because like my reading comprehension is my best way to learn.
Sure.
Oh, really? No, I'm just kidding. Patrick's made a comment, but but I honestly think that it's like, since I read it, it helps me a little bit more. But I mean, for some reason, sometimes when you guys are going through stuff in class, if I look away too briefly, or like if my cat does something, I am fucked. I can't do anything. But yeah,
totally get it. And it is tough, especially in a remote class, because like the only way I know how to teach is project-based teaching, right? And it's like, yeah, at the beginning of React, we go over a couple slides, a couple terms, or we get the concept, we go practice the concept. But the end of the day, the way that not only I know how to teach, but the best way I think the best way I think to learn how to program is to build, right? Is to see a little concept, to practice the concept, to see it work, and then practice that over and over again in different projects. But that's not to discount, hey, if your learning style is reading, unfortunately, that's on the opposite side of the color wheel of my teaching style, right? So if you find a resource that works, not only should you use it, but you should share it with the class. Even if you feel like you're a couple weeks behind, share it with the class and throw a note on it of, hey, this isn't just something that I'm learning with. It's, hey, I'm liking this because it's text-based and reading comprehension is something that I learn from. So if you're a reader, then, this is a great resource for you.
it is a huge help, but I know you will be too tomorrow. But thank you. And I'm gonna make the I'm gonna make the Calendly link right now, but it's kind of messing up in terms of Mountain Time and Eastern Time, and it's confusing the shit out of me. So
there should be a little drop down in the bottom left, I think, for your time zone.
Oh, if I just go one more half an inch down. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that confuses the crap out of me when I fly out to visit my brother and I'm looking at my calendar. I'm like, why is this meeting at 5 a.m.? And then I'm like, oh crap, it's 5 a.m. here. Which isn't terrible. What's terrible is when you book an appointment and you go to put it in your calendar and then you get back and you're like, no, I booked that for the morning. Why is it in the afternoon? It's because the whole thing shifted. And then the only other thing I'll say on that is Calendly lets you do a cancellation literally the minute before the event starts. So if something pops up, either shoot me a Slack message or just find the Calendly email and cancel it. And that syncs to my calendar within a minute or two and shoots me an email. So I would rather you have something in the books and cancel it if you can't make it than, just put it off because my calendar locks out, I think, 14 hours before the event. I did see a hand up. Was it Naj? Do you have a question?
Yeah, never mind.
Okay.
Hi, Max. Do you think we can go in a breakout room really quick? Thanks.
Can you make me co-host first?
Oh, good call.
I just realized that I'm not.
All set.
Thanks.
Zona gets the prize for the first Stump the Teacher of the year of the cohort.
What was it?
I don't know. I still don't know.
Well, like,
Still
what was the
stumped.
question?
There was she took some vanilla HTML and CSS and moved it over to React, and the CSS is like half applying to it, but then there's something as innocent as like background that just doesn't show up in the browser.
I had that issue when I was starting my transport overs too. Some of it had to do with the CSS not applying properly and having to change a couple of things. And the other things had to do that when it was in JavaScript, there was like a small like slash or like an arrow missing, like some little thing that was out of place.
Yeah, it has something probably to do with the way we're doing the selectors and the fact that like we're doing them as separate pages, so we can't apply the style sheet to the whole body. But the selector that I was looking at was like, oh, it's a div right inside this ID, and that ID exists, and so we'll figure it out.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Max, I need a little bit of help too, but it has to do with my resume. Can we go on now?
Sure.
So,
Sure. Oh, Zoom hates me. I can't. I can't get Exona out of the room, even though she's in this room. Okay, hold on. Let me try this again. Are you kidding me? Screw. Just make a new room. Oh, here we go. Move to room. Yes, there we go. Most of you guys figured out it was 8:30 and you could head out. Any final questions in here? All right. Then have a great night, everyone.
Bye, guys. Have a great weekend.
See ya.